The clock on Dr. David Kim's computer screen showed 11:47 p.m. when he finally pushed back from his desk. His eyes burned from staring at data charts for the past 16 hours straight. Empty coffee cups sat scattered around his home office like small monuments to his dedication. The latest batch of test results from his cancer research lay spread across 3 monitors, each screen telling a piece of a story that could change millions of lives. David rubbed his temples and let out a long breath. At 34, he had already published more research papers than most scientists twice his age. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he was closer than ever to a breakthrough that had consumed the last 3 years of his life. The protein sequences were finally making sense. The cellular responses were showing exactly what he had hoped for. Yet his brain felt like mush. He needed air. He needed to move. He needed to think. Standing up from his chair, David's back cracked in 3 places. He had been sitting in the same position for so long that his left leg had gone completely numb. He limped around his office trying to get the blood flowing again. The house was quiet except for the humming of his lab equipment in the basement. His wife was visiting her sister in Portland, which meant he had the place to himself for the week. This was both a blessing and a curse. Without anyone to remind him to eat or sleep, David could work for days straight, but it also meant he sometimes forgot he was human and needed basic things like food and rest. Walking to his bedroom, David grabbed a dark blue hoodie from his closet. The October air had been getting colder each night, and he knew the walk he was planning would take him through some shaded areas where the temperature dropped even more. The hoodie was old and comfortable, a gift from his college days that had somehow survived multiple moves and career changes. As he pulled the hoodie over his head, David thought about the problem that had been bothering him all evening. The cancer cells in his latest test batch were responding to the treatment, but not fast enough. He needed to find a way to speed up the process without damaging healthy cells. It was like trying to thread a needle while riding a bicycle. David had learned long ago that his best thinking happened when he was walking. Something about the rhythm of his feet hitting the pavement seemed to unlock parts of his brain that stayed closed when he was sitting at a desk. Some of his most important discoveries had come to him during late-night walks through his neighborhood. The neighborhood where David lived was one of those places where old money met new technology. Historic houses from the early 1900s sat next to modern glass structures owned by tech executives and successful doctors. David's own house was somewhere in between, a 1950s ranch style that he had filled with the latest scientific equipment. He had moved here 3 years ago when his research grant came through. The university had offered him a chance to work from home, as long as he met certain publication requirements and shared his findings with the larger research community. It was a dream setup for someone who preferred working alone. Stepping outside, David immediately felt the cool air hit his face. It was exactly what he needed. The stress of the day began to melt away as he started walking down his quiet street. Streetlights created pools of yellow light every 50 feet, with dark spaces in between. Most of the houses were dark, their owners long asleep. David's mind immediately went back to the protein sequences he had been studying. He visualized the molecular structures in his head, turning them around like 3D puzzles. What if he approached the problem from a different angle? What if instead of trying to speed up the treatment, he found a way to make the cancer cells more receptive to it? As he walked, David barely noticed his surroundings. This was his neighborhood, a place where he felt completely safe. He had walked these streets hundreds of times, usually late at night when his brain was too active to sleep. The neighbors were used to seeing the occasional night owl, and he had never had any problems. Tonight, however, David was more distracted than usual. The breakthrough he was working on represented years of research and millions of dollars in funding. If he could prove his theory, it would mean a new treatment option for thousands of cancer patients. The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. He walked past the Johnson house with its perfectly manicured lawn and garden gnomes. Then came the Miller place with the old oak tree that dropped leaves all over the sidewalk. David kicked through a small pile of autumn leaves, enjoying the crunching sound they made under his feet. The walking was working its magic. Already, David could feel his mind starting to make new connections. What if the problem wasn't with his treatment at all? What if the issue was with how he was measuring the results? Maybe the cancer cells were responding faster than his tests could detect. David pulled out his phone to make a voice note about this new idea, but realized he had left it charging on his kitchen counter. He would have to remember this thought until he got home. He picked up his pace slightly, excited to get back to his computer and test this new theory. As he turned the corner onto Maple Street, David noticed how quiet everything was. Even the usual sounds of distant traffic were muted tonight. It was the kind of silence that made him feel like he was the only person awake in the entire world. This feeling of solitude had always appealed to him. Some of his best work happened when he felt disconnected from the everyday world. The houses on Maple Street were bigger and older than the ones on his street. Many of them had been built in the early 1900s by wealthy families who wanted to escape the noise of the growing city. Now they housed a mix of retirees, young families, and professionals like himself. David slowed down as he approached a particularly beautiful Victorian house, painted in deep blue with white trim. The architectural details fascinated him. The intricate woodwork around the windows and doors reminded him of the traditional buildings he had seen as a child when his family visited his grandparents in Seoul. There was something about the craftsmanship of older buildings that modern construction just couldn't match. He stopped walking and stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the house's elaborate roofline. In the dim streetlight, he could make out decorative elements that must have taken months to carve by hand. It was the kind of attention to detail that his own scientific work required. Every measurement had to be perfect. Every variable had to be controlled. Every result had to be verified multiple times. As David stood there appreciating the architecture, his mind continued working on the cancer research problem. The cellular structures he was studying were just as complex as the woodwork on this old house. Both required patience, skill, and an understanding of how individual pieces fit together to create something larger and more meaningful. He had no idea that his moment of quiet appreciation was about to change everything. David was simply a tired scientist taking a walk to clear his head, enjoying the peace of a sleeping neighborhood and thinking about work that could help save lives. In a few minutes, his ordinary evening would become anything but ordinary. Betty Henderson had always been a light sleeper, but lately she barely slept at all. At 67, she found herself waking up multiple times each night, usually around midnight and then again around 3 in the morning. Tonight was no different. The digital clock next to her bed glowed 11:52 p.m. when her eyes opened for no particular reason. She lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the familiar sounds of her old house settling for the night. The furnace kicked on with its usual wheeze and rattle. Somewhere in the walls, pipes creaked as they expanded and contracted. These sounds had once bothered her when she first moved to this neighborhood 40 years ago, but now they were as comforting as a lullaby. Betty's late husband used to joke that she had radar for anything unusual happening on their street. You could hear a cat sneeze 3 houses away, he would say, shaking his head with amusement. It was true. Betty noticed everything. She knew which neighbors left for work early, which ones stayed up late, and which ones had visitors on weekends. This awareness had served her well over the years. She had called the fire department when the Peterson house had an electrical problem that could have burned down half the block. She had noticed when old Mr. Garcia stopped picking up his newspaper and called for a welfare check that may have saved his life. Betty saw herself as an unofficial neighborhood watch captain, even though no such organization existed on their quiet street. But recently, her vigilance had taken on a more urgent tone. 3 weeks ago, the Yamamoto family 2 streets over had their house broken into while they were visiting relatives in California. The thieves had taken electronics, jewelry, and even some family photos. Last week, someone had tried to break into cars parked on Pine Street just 5 blocks away. The local news had started running stories about a string of break-ins across their part of the city. The police said the crimes were being committed by someone who knew the neighborhood well, someone who could move around without attracting attention. The thought of a criminal walking around her peaceful streets made Betty's stomach turn. Unable to fall back asleep, Betty decided to get up and make herself a cup of chamomile tea. As she shuffled toward the kitchen in her slippers, she automatically glanced out the front window, as she had done thousands of times before. Usually she saw nothing more interesting than the occasional raccoon or stray cat. Tonight was different. Across the street, about 3 houses down, Betty could see a figure walking slowly along the sidewalk. The person was wearing dark clothing with a hood pulled up, which immediately caught her attention. In all her years of living in this neighborhood, she had never seen anyone walking around this late at night dressed like that. Betty moved closer to the window, being careful to stay behind the curtain so she wouldn't be seen. The figure was moving deliberately, not like someone out for exercise or walking a dog. There was no dog anyway. The person seemed to be looking at houses, stopping occasionally to stare at them for longer than seemed normal. Her heart began to beat faster. This looked exactly like what the police had described in their neighborhood safety meeting last month. They had said burglars often cased houses before breaking into them, walking around to check for security cameras, easy entry points, and signs that the owners were home. The figure stopped directly in front of the beautiful Victorian house that belonged to the retired art teacher, Helen Morrison. Helen was currently visiting her daughter in Denver and wouldn't be back for another week. Betty knew this because she had promised to keep an eye on Helen's house while she was away. From her window, Betty watched as the hooded figure stood motionless, apparently studying Helen's house. The person's head moved up and down, as if taking inventory of windows, doors, and possible ways to get inside. Betty's hands began to shake slightly. She had read enough crime reports to know that burglars often targeted houses when they knew the owners were away. Betty tried to get a better look at the person, but the streetlight was too dim and the hood obscured their face completely. She couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, young or old. All she could see was the dark clothing and the deliberate, suspicious behavior. The figure began moving again, walking slowly past 2 more houses before stopping again. This time they paused in front of the Martinez family's home. Betty knew that Roberto Martinez worked night shifts at the hospital, and his wife Ana would be home alone with their 2 young children. The thought of someone planning to break into a house with children inside made Betty feel sick. Betty had lived through enough changes in her neighborhood to know that things weren't always as safe as they used to be. When she and her husband first moved here, people didn't even lock their doors. Children played outside until dark without any adults worrying about them. Now, everyone had security systems and motion lights. She thought about her conversation with her neighbor Phil just last week. They had talked about how the recent break-ins were making everyone nervous. Phil had mentioned that his wife was now afraid to go on her evening walks alone. Other neighbors had started talking about forming an official neighborhood watch group. Betty picked up her cordless phone from the kitchen counter. The smart thing to do would be to call the police. Even if this person turned out to be harmless, it was better to be safe than sorry. The police had specifically asked residents to report any suspicious activity, especially late at night. But Betty hesitated. What if she was wrong? What if this was just someone out for a late walk who happened to dress in dark clothing? She didn't want to waste police time or embarrass an innocent person. On the other hand, what if she didn't call and something terrible happened to one of her neighbors? She looked out the window again. The hooded figure was now standing in front of another house, one where she knew the owners were currently asleep upstairs. The person's posture and movement still looked suspicious to her. They seemed to be studying the house rather than simply walking past it. Betty thought about Helen Morrison's house sitting empty and vulnerable. She thought about Ana Martinez alone with her children. She thought about all the news reports about break-ins and the police asking for community vigilance. Her decision was made. Betty dialed 911, her fingers moving quickly over the familiar numbers. When the operator answered, Betty spoke clearly and calmly as she had practiced in her mind many times. I'd like to report suspicious activity in my neighborhood. There's someone walking around in dark clothing, looking at houses. Given the recent break-ins in our area, I'm concerned they might be planning something. The operator asked for Betty's address and a description of what she was seeing. Betty provided all the details she could, emphasizing that the person's behavior seemed very different from a normal evening walk. The operator assured her that officers would be dispatched to check on the situation. After hanging up, Betty returned to her window post. The hooded figure was still moving slowly through her neighborhood, stopping occasionally to look at different houses. She felt confident that she had done the right thing. Better to be overly cautious than to regret not acting when she had the chance. Within minutes, Betty could see police car headlights turning onto her street. She felt a sense of relief knowing that professional law enforcement officers would soon handle whatever the situation turned out to be. If the person was innocent, they could explain themselves and be on their way. If they were planning something criminal, they would be stopped before anyone got hurt. Betty, had no way of knowing that her concerned phone call was about to create a situation that would change multiple lives and challenge everything she thought she knew about judging people by their appearance. Officer Tony Rivera had been patrolling these quiet suburban streets for almost 8 years, and calls like this one were becoming more common. His partner tonight, Officer Jake Thompson, was newer to the force but had quickly learned that residential areas could be just as unpredictable as downtown beats. When dispatch crackled through their radio with reports of suspicious activity on Maple Street, both officers responded with the professional alertness that had become second nature. Possible prowler, male subject in dark clothing, reported by resident on Maple Street. The dispatcher's voice cut through the quiet hum of their patrol car. Subject observed examining multiple residences in the area. Be advised there have been several break-ins in surrounding neighborhoods over the past month. Rivera adjusted his radio and glanced at Thompson. Probably another false alarm, but we need to check it out thoroughly. These break-ins have everyone on edge. Thompson nodded, reviewing the recent crime reports on their mobile computer. 3 residential burglaries within a 5-mile radius this month. The detective unit thinks it might be the same person or group. They've been hitting houses when owners are away or asleep. As they turned onto Maple Street, Rivera slowed the patrol car and began scanning the sidewalks and front yards. The street was lined with mature trees that created deep shadows between the pools of streetlight. Perfect conditions for someone to move around unnoticed, but also perfect conditions for innocent people to be mistaken for criminals. There, Thompson pointed ahead. Dark clothing, hood up, standing in front of that Victorian house. Rivera could see the figure clearly now. A person in a dark hoodie stood motionless on the sidewalk, facing toward one of the larger houses on the block. The body language looked exactly like what they had been trained to watch for someone examining a potential target, rather than simply passing by. "Let's approach carefully," Rivera said, turning off their headlights to avoid spooking the subject. "Remember, we don't know if this person is armed or how they'll react to seeing us." They parked about half a block away and got out of their patrol car quietly. Both officers had their hands near their service weapons, not because they expected violence, but because proper procedure required them to be prepared for any situation. In their years of experience, they had learned that seemingly routine calls could turn dangerous in seconds. David was completely lost in thought, staring up at the intricate woodwork around the Victorian house's windows, when he heard footsteps behind him. His mind was still processing the new approach to his cancer research, and the sound didn't immediately register as anything concerning. He assumed it was another neighbor out for a late walk. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Rivera called out, his voice firm but not hostile. "Police, we'd like to speak with you." The sound of the word police hit David like a splash of cold water. He spun around quickly, his mind racing to understand why law enforcement would want to talk to him. As he turned, his hood shifted, obscuring his vision momentarily. "Could you keep your hands where we can see them, please?" Thompson added, noting how the subject's quick movement in the darkness made it difficult to assess any potential threat. David was genuinely confused. He had been walking through his own neighborhood, looking at architecture, thinking about his research. Nothing he was doing seemed remotely police-worthy. His fatigue from working 16 hours straight wasn't helping his ability to process this unexpected situation. "Is there a problem, officers?" David asked, his slight accent becoming more pronounced due to stress and tiredness. After working for so many hours, his English sometimes reverted to the more formal patterns he had learned as a child. "We received reports of someone acting suspiciously in this area," Rivera explained, maintaining a professional tone while studying David's demeanor. "There have been break-ins nearby recently, so we're checking on anyone out late at night." David's confusion deepened. Acting suspiciously? He had simply been walking and looking at houses. But as he thought about it from the officer's perspective, he realized how his behavior might appear. A hooded figure standing still in front of houses late at night, especially during a series of break-ins, would naturally draw attention. "I live here," David said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of his house. "I was just taking a walk to clear my head. I work from home and sometimes I walk late at night to think." Thompson exchanged a glance with Rivera. The subject's explanation was plausible, but they heard similar stories from actual criminals trying to talk their way out of suspicious situations. Their training emphasized the importance of verifying information rather than simply accepting explanations. Can you provide some identification? Rivera asked. And which house do you live in specifically? This seemed like a reasonable request to David. He reached toward his hoodie pocket where he kept his wallet, the movement automatic and innocent in his mind. He was thinking about the quickest way to resolve this misunderstanding, so he could get back to his research. But from the officer's perspective, David's movement toward his pocket triggered immediate alarm bells. In low-light conditions with a subject they knew nothing about, any sudden reach toward concealed areas of clothing represented a potential threat. Their training had drilled into them that weapons could be hidden anywhere, and that split-second decisions often meant the difference between going home safely and becoming a casualty statistic. "Stop right there," Thompson commanded sharply, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Keep your hands visible." David froze, his hand halfway to his pocket, suddenly understanding that the situation was far more serious than he had realized. The officer's tense body language and sharp commands made it clear that they viewed him as a potential threat, not just someone to question casually. "I was just reaching for my wallet," David said slowly, raising his hands away from his pocket. "My identification is in there." "We understand," Rivera said, his voice controlled but firm. "But we need you to follow our instructions exactly. Turn around and place your hands on the fence behind you." David's mind reeled. This was escalating far beyond what seemed reasonable for a simple misunderstanding. He was a respected scientist, a homeowner in this neighborhood, someone who had never been in trouble with the law. But he also recognized that arguing with police officers in the middle of the night would only make things worse. "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding," David said, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable. "I can explain who I am if you'll just let me show you my identification." "Sir, we need you to comply with our instructions first," Thompson responded. "Once we've secured the situation, we can look at your identification and sort this out." The word "secured" bothered David. It implied that he was some kind of threat that needed to be controlled. His fatigue was making it harder to think clearly, and his accent was becoming more noticeable as stress affected his speech patterns. He worried that his difficulty communicating clearly was making the officers more suspicious. "Please turn around and place your hands on the fence," Rivera repeated, his patience wearing thin. From his perspective, a potentially suspicious person was hesitating to follow basic police commands, which often indicated guilty behavior or plans to flee. David looked at the officers' faces and realized that this situation had moved beyond simple conversation. These were trained law enforcement professionals doing their job, responding to what they believed was a legitimate threat to neighborhood safety. His scientific mind understood the logic of their caution, even as he felt frustrated by the misunderstanding. Slowly, David turned around and placed his hands flat against the wooden fence, feeling the rough texture of the old boards against his palms. The position felt humiliating and scary, but he told himself that cooperation would lead to a quick resolution once they verified his identity. Behind him, he could hear the officers moving closer, their radio crackling with communications he couldn't quite understand. The night air felt colder now, and David realized that his simple walk to clear his head had somehow transformed into the most frightening experience of his adult life. Standing with his hands pressed against the cold wooden fence, David felt his heart pounding in his chest. The scientific part of his mind noted how stress was affecting his body: increased heart rate, shallow breathing, heightened awareness of every sound and sensation. But the human part of his mind was simply scared and confused about how a peaceful evening walk had led to this moment. "Stay exactly where you are," Officer Rivera instructed as he approached from behind. "We're going to check you for weapons, and then we can sort this out." David had never been searched by police before. He had lived a quiet, law-abiding life focused on research and scientific discovery. The most dangerous thing he typically handled was laboratory chemicals, and even those were carefully controlled and regulated. The idea that anyone would think he might be carrying a weapon seemed absurd. "Officers, I'm not armed," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm a scientist. I was just walking and thinking about my research. I really think there's been a mistake." Officer Thompson moved to David's left side while Rivera positioned himself on the right. This was standard procedure for officer safety, but to David, it felt like being surrounded by people who viewed him as dangerous. The feeling was both terrifying and surreal. "That's what we're going to determine," Rivera replied, beginning to pat down David's jacket pockets. We need to make sure everyone stays safe while we figure out what's going on." As Rivera's hand searched his pockets, David felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. He thought about his colleagues at the university, his research team, his wife visiting her sister. What would they think if they could see him now, being treated like a criminal on a public street? "There's a wallet in his right pocket," Rivera announced to his partner, "and what feels like a phone in the left pocket." "I told you I was reaching for my wallet," David said, a note of frustration creeping into his voice despite his efforts to stay calm. "My identification is in there. My address, my university ID, everything that proves I live here." Thompson stepped back slightly and spoke into his radio, calling for backup and running a preliminary check on the address David had mentioned. Standard procedure required verification of all claims made by subjects during field investigations, especially in areas with recent criminal activity. "Sir, we're going to need you to stay in this position while we verify your information," Rivera explained as he carefully removed David's wallet from his pocket. "There have been multiple break-ins in this area recently, and we have to take every report seriously." David's legs were starting to shake, partly from the cold and partly from stress. He had been working for 16 hours straight before starting his walk, and the combination of exhaustion and adrenaline was taking its toll on his body. His mind kept racing between trying to understand the officer's perspective and feeling outraged at being treated like a criminal. "Can you at least look at my ID now?" David asked. "It has my address on it. You can see that I live just 3 blocks from here." Rivera opened the wallet and used his flashlight to examine the contents. He found David's driver's license, university identification card, credit cards, and several business cards from scientific conferences. The address on the license was indeed just a few blocks away, exactly where David had said he lived. "The ID looks legitimate," Rivera told Thompson quietly. "Address matches what he said. He's got university credentials, conference badges. Looks like he really is some kind of scientist." But both officers had been trained that fake identification was common among experienced criminals, and that someone planning burglaries might very well have studied the neighborhood enough to know local addresses. The fact that David's story was checking out didn't necessarily mean he was innocent. "Dr. David Kim," Rivera read from the license, "says here you're 34 years old, address on Oak Street." "That's right," David confirmed, feeling a spark of hope that this nightmare might be ending. "I moved there 3 years ago when I got my research grant. I work mostly from home studying cancer treatments." Thompson finished his radio conversation and approached his partner. "Dispatch confirms that address exists and matches the name on the license. But I've got a problem, Tony. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who called this in, is insisting she saw this subject examining multiple houses like he was planning break-ins. She's very concerned and wants to make sure we don't just let him go." David's heart sank. He realized that someone had been watching him and had interpreted his innocent appreciation of architecture as criminal behavior. The irony wasn't lost on him that his habit of studying details, something that made him a good scientist, had now made him appear suspicious to a worried neighbor. "Ma'am, I understand your concern," David said, turning his head slightly toward the officers. "But I really was just looking at the houses because I find the architecture interesting. The Victorian house over there has amazing woodwork that reminds me of buildings I saw as a child." Rivera studied David's face in the streetlight, trying to assess his credibility. Years of police work had taught him to read people, but this case was challenging. The subject's story was consistent, his identification appeared genuine, and his manner seemed more like someone who was confused and scared rather than someone trying to deceive them. However, Rivera also knew that underestimating suspects had cost other officers their lives or careers. The recent spike in residential burglaries meant that every suspicious person call had to be taken seriously, regardless of how innocent the subject appeared. "Here's what's going to happen," Rivera decided. "We're going to need to take you to the station to verify your story completely. There have been too many break-ins lately for us to just take your word for everything, even with the ID." David felt the world spinning around him. "Take me to the station? You mean arrest me for what? Walking in my own neighborhood?" "We're not formally arresting you yet," Thompson clarified. "We're detaining you for investigation. Once we verify your identity and your story at the station, assuming everything checks out, you'll be free to go." The distinction between arrest and detention felt meaningless to David. Either way, he was going to be taken from his neighborhood in a police car, processed at a police station, and treated like a criminal. The thought of what this would do to his reputation and his research career made him feel sick. "This is ridiculous," David said, his control finally starting to slip. "I'm a cancer researcher. I'm trying to develop treatments that could save lives. I was just taking a walk to think about my work. How is any of this reasonable?" Rivera understood David's frustration, but he also understood that criminals often had elaborate cover stories and impressive-sounding occupations. His job was to protect the community, not to make judgment calls based on someone's claims about their profession. "Sir, I need you to put your hands behind your back," Rivera instructed, pulling out his handcuffs. "We're going to transport you to the station for processing. The faster we can verify your information, the faster this will be resolved." David stared at the handcuffs in disbelief. In all his years of education, research, and professional success, he had never imagined being handcuffed on a public street. The metal looked cold and harsh in the streetlight, a symbol of how completely his quiet evening had spiraled out of control. "Please don't do this," David said quietly. "I have important research to finish. People are depending on my work. Can't you just escort me to my house and verify that I live there?" "I'm sorry, but we have to follow procedure," Rivera replied, genuinely sympathetic but unwilling to compromise protocol. "The station has better resources for verification, and we need to document everything properly given the recent criminal activity in this area." As the handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists, David felt a combination of fear, anger, and disbelief that would stay with him for months to come. The metal was cold against his skin, and the position forced his shoulders into an uncomfortable angle that reminded him constantly of his powerless situation. "Watch your head," Thompson said as he guided David toward their patrol car, placing a protective hand on top of David's head as he was helped into the back seat. Sitting in the back of the police car, separated from the officers by a metal barrier, David looked out the window at the neighborhood where he had felt so safe just an hour ago. The familiar streets now looked different, somehow threatening and unwelcoming. He wondered if he would ever feel comfortable walking here again, and whether his neighbors would always see him as the suspicious man in the hoodie who had been arrested on Maple Street. The fluorescent lights in the police station lobby buzzed with an annoying frequency that made David's headache worse. After 16 hours of research followed by his arrest, exhaustion was hitting him like a physical weight. The plastic chair where he sat was uncomfortable and too small, clearly designed more for functionality than comfort. His wrist still ached from the handcuffs, which had been removed only after he was safely inside the building. Detective Linda Martinez had been working the night shift for 12 years, long enough to develop a sixth sense about people and situations. When officers Rivera and Thompson brought in their suspected prowler, something immediately struck her as unusual. Most people arrested for suspicious activity fell into predictable categories: young troublemakers, homeless individuals, or people with obvious substance abuse problems. This man didn't fit any of those patterns. David sat quietly, not demanding to call a lawyer or protesting his innocence loudly like many suspects did. Instead, he seemed genuinely puzzled by the entire situation, as if he couldn't quite believe where he found himself. His clothes were clean and well-maintained, his speech was educated, and his overall demeanor suggested someone more accustomed to lecture halls than police stations. "Dr. Kim," Detective Martinez said, pulling up a chair across from him, "I'm going to ask you some questions to help us verify your story. The more cooperative you are, the faster we can resolve this situation." David looked up at her with tired eyes. "I appreciate that, Detective. I just want to go home and get back to my work. I have experiments running that need attention." "Tell me about your work," Martinez said, genuinely curious. The identification in David's wallet included several cards from scientific conferences and a university badge that looked authentic. If this man was a criminal, he had gone to extraordinary lengths to create a believable cover story. "I'm a biochemist specializing in cancer research," David explained, his voice becoming more animated despite his exhaustion. "I'm working on targeted therapy treatments that could help cancer cells become more receptive to existing drugs. It's complicated, but basically I'm trying to find ways to make chemotherapy more effective with fewer side effects." Martinez had investigated hundreds of cases involving people who lied about their occupations. She had learned to spot the telltale signs when someone was making up details about a job they didn't really have. But David spoke about his research with the kind of specific knowledge and genuine passion that would be nearly impossible to fake. "And you do this work from home?" she asked, making notes on her clipboard. "Yes, I have a laboratory set up in my basement and office equipment throughout the house," David said. "The university gave me a special grant to work independently as long as I publish my findings and collaborate with other researchers. It's actually ideal for the kind of detailed work I do." Martinez stood up and walked to her computer terminal. "I'm going to make some phone calls to verify your information. In the meantime, would you like some coffee or water?" "Coffee would be great, thank you," David replied. "I've been working all day and I'm running on fumes." As Martinez walked away, David looked around the police station with the same observational skills that made him good at research. The building was older, probably built in the 1980s with that institutional green paint that seemed to exist only in government buildings. Officers moved back and forth with the casual efficiency of people comfortable in their work environment. Martinez returned with a cup of coffee and sat back down. "Dr. Kim, I have to ask you this directly. Were you examining those houses tonight with any intention of breaking into them?" "Absolutely not," David said firmly. "I was looking at the architecture because I find it interesting. The Victorian house where the officers found me has incredible woodwork that reminds me of traditional buildings I saw as a child in Korea. I often look at houses when I walk, the same way some people might look at cars or gardens. Why were you walking so late at night?" David rubbed his temples, trying to ease his headache. "I do my best thinking when I walk, especially when I'm stuck on a research problem. Tonight I was working on protein sequences for my cancer treatment, and I needed to clear my head. I've walked through that neighborhood hundreds of times, usually late at night when my brain is too active to sleep." Martinez found David's explanation believable, but she had learned not to trust her instincts completely. Some of the most convincing liars she had encountered were highly educated people who could spin elaborate stories on the spot. She needed concrete verification before she could recommend releasing him. "I'm going to call your university and see if I can verify your employment," she said, picking up her phone. "The main number will just get you a security service after hours," David said helpfully. "But Dr. Robert Wilson is my department head and he's usually awake late. His home number should be in the university directory." Martinez paused, surprised by David's willingness to provide additional verification. In her experience, people with something to hide typically tried to delay or complicate the verification process, not make it easier. She called the university's main number first and was indeed connected to a security office. The guard on duty confirmed that David Kim was listed as a faculty researcher, but couldn't provide detailed information about his current status or projects. Martinez then asked to be connected to the directory service to find Dr. Wilson's contact information. While waiting for the connection, Martinez studied David more carefully. His hands were soft but stained with what looked like chemical residue, the kind of subtle discoloration that would be nearly impossible to fake. His clothes smelled faintly of laboratory cleaning solvents. His fingernails were short and clean, consistent with someone who worked with precise instruments. "Dr. Wilson," Martinez said when the call connected. "This is Detective Martinez with the city police. I'm sorry to call so late, but I need to verify the employment status of someone who says he works in your department." David could hear only Martinez's side of the conversation, but he felt hopeful as she asked detailed questions about his research, his work schedule, and his tendency to work unusual hours. Dr. Wilson had been his mentor and supervisor for 3 years and knew him well enough to provide thorough verification. "Yes, that matches exactly what he told me," Martinez said into the phone. "And you say he often works through the night? I see. And his research is legitimate, funded by federal grants?" "Thank you, Dr. Wilson. This has been very helpful." Martinez hung up and looked at David with a completely different expression. The suspicion had been replaced by curiosity, and what might have been the beginning of an apology. "Dr. Wilson confirms everything you told me," she said. "He says you're one of the most dedicated researchers he's ever worked with, and that you often lose track of time when you're focused on a project. He also mentioned that you take walks late at night to process complex problems." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. "So I can go home now?" "We're getting there," Martinez said. "But I need to ask you about the specific houses you were looking at tonight. The neighbor who called us was very concerned about your behavior." "I was just appreciating the architecture," David said again. "I grew up in a family of engineers, and I've always been fascinated by construction and design. When I walk, I often stop to look at interesting buildings the same way other people might stop to look at a nice car or a beautiful garden. Martinez nodded. Dr. Wilson mentioned that you have a tendency to focus intensely on details, whether it's research or other interests. He said it's part of what makes you good at scientific work. That's true, David agreed. My mind works by examining individual components and figuring out how they fit together into larger systems. Whether it's protein molecules or Victorian woodwork, I'm drawn to understanding how things are constructed. As Martinez continued her questioning, she became increasingly convinced that David was exactly who he claimed to be, an exhausted scientist who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, wearing the wrong clothes and exhibiting behavior that looked suspicious to a worried neighbor. But she also understood why the neighbor had been concerned. With recent break-ins in the area, a hooded figure examining houses late at night would naturally raise alarm bells. The tragedy was that David's innocent behavior had perfectly mimicked the suspicious activity that residents had been warned to watch for. Dr. Kim, I'm going to need to make a few more calls to complete our verification process, Martinez said. But based on what I've learned so far, it seems clear that this has been a misunderstanding. I want to apologize for the way this evening has unfolded for you. David felt tears of relief starting to form in his eyes. Thank you for taking the time to investigate properly. I was starting to worry that no one would believe me. The officers who arrested you were doing their job correctly, Martinez explained. Given the recent criminal activity and the neighbor's report, they had to treat you as a potential threat until we could verify otherwise. But now that we're getting the full picture, we can start working toward getting you home. As Martinez prepared to make additional verification calls, David sat back in his uncomfortable plastic chair and tried to process everything that had happened. In the span of a few hours, Detective Martinez returned to her desk with a growing sense that she was dealing with an innocent man who had been caught in an unfortunate series of circumstances. Her instincts, honed by years of investigating real criminals, told her that David was telling the truth. But instincts weren't enough. She needed concrete evidence to justify releasing someone who had been arrested on suspicion of planning burglaries. She picked up David's wallet again and examined its contents more carefully. Along with his driver's license and university ID, she found membership cards for several scientific organizations, a library card, and what appeared to be a coffee shop loyalty card that was nearly full. These were the everyday items carried by someone living a normal, law-abiding life, not the carefully constructed false identity of a professional criminal. Martinez's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Detective Martinez," she answered. "This is campus security at the university," the caller said. "You called earlier asking about Dr. David Kim. I've pulled his file and can provide some additional information if it would be helpful." "Please go ahead," Martinez said, grabbing a notepad. "Dr. Kim has been working here for 3 years under a federal research grant. His security clearance is current, and he has 24-hour access to the laboratory facilities. He's never had any disciplinary issues, and his research has been published in several major scientific journals. The department head speaks very highly of him." Martinez wrote down the details, noting how they continued to support David's story. "Has he ever had any problems with campus security? Any complaints or incidents?" "None at all," the security officer replied. "Actually, his biggest issue is that he sometimes forgets to sign out of the lab when he works through the night. We've had to call him a few times to make sure he was okay when his keycard showed him entering, but never leaving." This detail struck Martinez as particularly convincing. Someone planning a fake identity wouldn't include such specific, mundane information about work habits. It was exactly the kind of minor detail that made David's story ring true. After hanging up, Martinez decided to call David's emergency contact, which was listed on his university paperwork as Dr. Lisa Park. The phone rang several times before a sleepy voice answered. "Hello," Dr. Park said, clearly having been woken up. "Dr. Park, this is Detective Martinez with the city police. I'm sorry to wake you, but I need to ask you about Dr. David Kim." There was a pause as Dr. Park processed this unexpected information. "David, is he okay?" "What's happened?" "He's safe, but he's been detained for questioning regarding suspicious activity in his neighborhood. I'm trying to verify his identity and his story about what he was doing tonight." "Suspicious activity?" Dr. Park sounded genuinely confused. "David is the least suspicious person I know. He's probably the most honest, straightforward scientist I've ever worked with. What kind of suspicious activity? Martinez explained the circumstances of David's arrest, leaving out some of the more dramatic details to avoid unnecessarily alarming his colleague. As she spoke, she could hear Dr. Park getting out of bed and moving around, presumably getting dressed. That sounds exactly like David, Dr. Park said when Martinez finished. He takes walks late at night all the time, especially when he's working on a difficult problem. And he's always stopping to look at buildings and architecture. It's just how his mind works. He analyzes everything around him. Can you tell me about his current research? Martinez asked. He's working on targeted cancer therapies, trying to make existing treatments more effective. It's groundbreaking work that could help thousands of patients. David is completely dedicated to it. Sometimes I have to remind him to eat and sleep because he gets so focused. Dr. Park paused, then continued with obvious concern in her voice. Detective, David is one of the most ethical, law-abiding people I know. He volunteers at the free clinic, he mentors undergraduate students, and he's never even gotten a parking ticket as far as I know. If someone thinks he was planning to commit a crime, they've made a serious mistake. What can you tell me about his background? Martinez asked, making more notes. He immigrated with his family when he was 12, worked his way through college, earned his PhD in biochemistry, and has dedicated his career to medical research. He's exactly the kind of person any community would be lucky to have as a neighbor. Martinez could hear the sincerity in Dr. Park's voice, and her description of David matched everything else she had learned during her investigation. Dr. Park, would you be willing to come to the station to help verify Dr. Kim's identity? Absolutely, Dr. Park replied without hesitation. I'll be there in 20 minutes. And detective, please treat David well. He's a good man who's never hurt anyone in his life. After ending the call, Martinez returned to where David was sitting. He looked up hopefully as she approached, clearly anxious to learn what her investigation had revealed. Dr. Kim, I've spoken with your university security office and your colleague Dr. Park, Martinez said. Everything they've told me supports your story completely. David felt a wave of gratitude toward his colleagues who had vouched for him without hesitation. Dr. Park is coming here? She should arrive soon, Martinez confirmed. In the meantime, I want to explain what's going to happen next. Based on my investigation, I believe you're telling the truth about who you are and what you were doing tonight. However, we still need to complete our documentation and have Dr. Park formally verify your identity. I understand, David said, and I appreciate how thoroughly you've investigated this. I know the officers were just doing their job when they arrested me. Martinez sat down across from David again. Can I ask you something? When you take these late-night walks, do you realize how your behavior might appear to others? David considered the question carefully. I suppose I don't think about it much. I'm usually so absorbed in whatever research problem I'm working on that I don't pay attention to how I might look to observers. Tonight I was thinking about protein sequences and molecular interactions, not about how a neighbor might interpret my interest in architecture. The neighbor who called us was genuinely concerned about recent break-ins in the area, Martinez explained. When she saw someone in dark clothing examining houses late at night, it triggered all the warnings residents have been given about watching for suspicious activity. I can understand that, David said thoughtfully. If I had noticed someone behaving the way I was behaving, I might have been concerned too. It's just that from my perspective, I was doing something completely innocent. 20 minutes later, Dr. Park arrived at the police station looking worried and slightly out of breath. She had thrown on jeans and a sweater and driven across town as quickly as safely possible. When she saw David sitting in the lobby, her face showed a mixture of relief and anger. David, are you okay? She asked, rushing over to him. I'm fine, Lisa, just tired and confused about how this all happened. Dr. Park turned to Detective Martinez with fire in her eyes. How could you arrest one of the most decent people in our entire university? David Kim wouldn't steal a paperclip, let alone break into someone's house. Dr. Park, I understand your anger, Martinez said calmly. But the officers who made the arrest were responding to a legitimate report of suspicious activity. Given the recent break-ins in that neighborhood, they had to take the report seriously. Dr. Park pulled out her phone and showed Martinez several photos. This is David at our department's charity fundraiser last month. This is him volunteering at the children's hospital. This is him receiving an award for his research contributions. Does this look like someone who would commit crimes? Martinez looked at the photos, which showed David in various professional and volunteer settings, always smiling and surrounded by colleagues who clearly respected and liked him. The pictures painted a picture of someone deeply integrated into his professional and social community. "Dr. Park, your colleagues' character references are noted and appreciated," Martinez said. "Combined with all the other verification I've done tonight, I'm confident that this has been a case of mistaken identity and misinterpreted behavior." She turned to David. "Dr. Kim, we're going to release you tonight with our apologies for this misunderstanding. However, I'd like to suggest that in the future, you might consider walking during daylight hours or at least wearing lighter-colored clothing when you take evening walks." David nodded. "I'll definitely be more aware of how my behavior might appear to others. I never want to cause this kind of concern or waste police resources again." As Martinez began preparing David's release paperwork, she reflected on how this case highlighted the challenges of community policing in an era of heightened security concerns. Everyone involved had acted reasonably: the concerned neighbor, the responding officers, and even David himself. But the combination of circumstances had created a situation where an innocent person had been treated as a criminal simply for walking in his own neighborhood while thinking about his work. As Detective Martinez finished her paperwork, the full scope of the evening's events began to crystallize in her mind. She had spent years investigating actual criminals, people who broke into homes, stole valuables, and violated the safety that families depended on. Those cases usually involved individuals with criminal histories, substance abuse problems, or desperate circumstances that drove them to prey on others. David Kim represented the complete opposite of everything she associated with criminal behavior. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to helping others, working 16-hour days to develop treatments that could save cancer patients. While most people his age were focused on making money or advancing their careers, David was pouring his energy into research that might not pay off financially for years, if ever. "Dr. Kim," Martinez said, looking up from her computer screen, "I've been thinking about your research while I completed this paperwork. Can you explain in simple terms what you're trying to accomplish?" David's face lit up with the enthusiasm that always appeared when he talked about his work. Despite his exhaustion and the trauma of being arrested, his passion for science remained undimmed. "I'm working on what we call targeted cancer therapy," David explained. "Right now, chemotherapy drugs attack cancer cells, but they also damage healthy cells, which causes terrible side effects. I'm trying to develop treatments that make cancer cells more receptive to existing drugs, so we can use lower doses while maintaining effectiveness." "And if your research succeeds?" Martinez asked. "It could mean that cancer patients experience fewer side effects while getting better treatment outcomes. Imagine chemotherapy that doesn't cause hair loss, nausea, or immune system damage. Patients could maintain their quality of life while fighting their disease." Dr. Park, who had been listening quietly, added, "David's work has already shown promising results in laboratory settings. If his approach works in human trials, it could revolutionize cancer treatment for millions of people worldwide." Martinez shook her head in amazement. "So while you were being arrested as a suspected burglar, you were actually thinking about ways to save lives?" "That's exactly right," David said with a rueful smile. "I was walking and thinking about protein sequences, trying to figure out how to make my treatment work faster. It's ironic that my dedication to helping people somehow made me look like someone who wanted to hurt them." Officer Rivera, who had processed David's arrest, overheard this conversation as he was finishing his shift paperwork. He approached the group with obvious discomfort on his face. "Dr. Kim, I want to apologize for how this evening unfolded," Rivera said. "When we arrested you, we were following proper procedure based on the information we had. But knowing what I know now, I feel terrible about treating you like a criminal." David looked at the young officer with understanding rather than anger. "Officer Rivera, you were doing your job exactly right. A concerned neighbor reported suspicious activity, and you responded appropriately. You had no way of knowing who I was or what I was thinking about. But we handcuffed a cancer researcher and put him in a police car," Rivera said, clearly struggling with the situation. "A man who spends his life trying to help people. And if I had actually been a burglar planning to break into houses where families sleep, you would have prevented serious crimes," David replied. "I don't blame you for what happened. If anything, I'm grateful that my neighbors have police officers who take their safety concerns seriously." Detective Martinez watched this exchange with growing respect for David's character. Most people who had been wrongly arrested would be angry, demanding apologies, threatening lawsuits, or at least expressing resentment. Instead, David was showing empathy for the officers who had arrested him and understanding for the neighbor who had reported him. "Dr. Kim, can I ask you something personal?" Martinez said. "How do you stay so positive after an experience like this?" David thought for a moment before answering. "In my research, I deal with setbacks all the time. Experiments fail, theories don't work out, and progress is often slower than I hope. But I've learned that getting angry or bitter doesn't solve anything. The only productive response is to understand what happened, learn from it, and figure out how to move forward constructively." "That's a remarkable attitude," Martinez said. "But aren't you angry about being profiled because of your appearance?" David's expression grew more serious. "I'd be lying if I said this evening wasn't difficult and scary. Being handcuffed and arrested is traumatic, regardless of the circumstances. And yes, I do think my appearance and ethnicity probably influenced how my behavior was interpreted." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I also understand that people are genuinely afraid of crime, especially elderly residents like the neighbor who called you. Recent break-ins have made everyone more vigilant, and vigilance sometimes leads to misunderstandings." Dr. Park spoke up. "David, you're being too generous. What happened tonight was wrong, even if everyone had good intentions." "Maybe," David agreed, "but focusing on anger won't help anyone. Instead, I want to think about how we can prevent this kind of misunderstanding in the future." Martinez found herself impressed by David's perspective, but also concerned about the broader implications of what had occurred. "Dr. Kim, do you think this experience will change how you behave in your own neighborhood?" "Probably," David admitted. "I'll be more conscious of how my actions might appear to others, especially late at night. I might stick to more well-lit areas or wear brighter clothing. It's sad that I have to modify innocent behavior, but it's a practical reality." Officer Thompson, who had also been involved in the arrest, joined their conversation. "Dr. Kim, I've been thinking about this situation, and it bothers me that someone like you has to change their behavior because of unfounded suspicions." "It bothers me too," David replied. "But the alternative, changing how people think about others who look different from them, is much more difficult and takes much longer." "What do you mean?" Thompson asked. David considered how to explain his thoughts without sounding preachy. "People make split-second judgments based on limited information. A hooded figure at night plus recent break-ins plus someone who looks different equals suspicion. It's not necessarily racism, but it's not completely free from bias either." "So how do we fix that?" Martinez asked, genuinely curious about David's perspective. "Education, interaction, and time," David said. "When people get to know each other as individuals rather than as stereotypes, misunderstandings become less likely. Maybe what happened tonight could actually lead to something positive if it starts conversations about these issues." Dr. Park looked at her colleague with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "David, only you would try to turn your arrest into a teachable moment about community relations." David laughed for the first time since his ordeal began. "It's better than just being bitter about it. Besides, my work has taught me that complex problems usually require patient, systematic approaches rather than emotional reactions." As the group continued talking, Martinez realized that she was witnessing something unusual, a person who had been wronged responding with grace, wisdom, and a desire to create positive change rather than simply seeking justice or revenge. David's reaction to his arrest revealed as much about his character as all the verification calls she had made. "Dr. Kim," Martinez said, "I think you might be exactly the kind of neighbor this community needs. Someone who works to help others, who responds to conflict with understanding rather than anger, and who looks for ways to build bridges rather than walls." David smiled tiredly. "I just want to go home, get some sleep, and get back to my research. But if something good can come from tonight's misunderstanding, then maybe it wasn't completely pointless." As Martinez completed the final paperwork for David's release, she found herself hoping that more people would respond to adversity with the wisdom and grace that David had shown. The evening had started with a case of mistaken identity, but it was ending with a powerful lesson about character, community, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to understand the true nature of the people around us. 3 days after his arrest, David sat in his home office staring at the same protein sequences that had occupied his mind during that fateful evening walk. but concentration was difficult. Every time he heard a car door slam or footsteps on the sidewalk, his heart rate increased. The trauma of being handcuffed and arrested had left invisible wounds that were taking time to heal. His wife Jennifer had returned early from her sister's visit when Dr. Park called to explain what had happened. Jennifer's reaction had been a mixture of outrage, protective fury, and deep concern for David's emotional well-being. She had wanted to call lawyers, file complaints, and demand public apologies, but David had asked her to wait, to let him process the experience before deciding how to respond. The phone call that changed everything came on Thursday morning. Betty Henderson, the neighbor who had reported David's suspicious behavior, had learned from other residents about what had really happened that night. After 3 sleepless nights wrestling with guilt and embarrassment, she had gotten David's phone number from the neighborhood directory and worked up the courage to call him. "Dr. Kim," Betty said, her voice shaking with emotion. "This is Betty Henderson from Maple Street. I'm the person who called the police about you the other night." David had been expecting this call, though he wasn't sure how he felt about receiving it. "Hello, Mrs. Henderson. I need to apologize to you," Betty continued, clearly fighting back tears. "I learned from the police that you're a scientist working to cure cancer, and that you live in our neighborhood. I feel terrible about what I put you through." "Mrs. Henderson, you don't need to apologize," David said gently. "You saw something that concerned you and you reported it. Given the recent break-ins, that was a reasonable response." "But I was wrong," Betty insisted. "I made assumptions about you based on how you looked and what you were wearing. That's not who I want to be." David was quiet for a moment, considering his response. "Mrs. Henderson, can I ask you something? If you had seen someone who looked like your son or grandson doing exactly the same thing I was doing, would you have called the police?" Betty was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Probably not, and that's what makes this so hard to face." "I appreciate your honesty," David said, "and I appreciate you calling me. That took courage. Dr. Kim, I'd like to do something to make this right. Would you be willing to meet with me? Maybe you could tell me about your research and I could learn more about who you really are." David found himself surprised by his own response. "I'd like that, Mrs. Henderson. I think it would be good for both of us." They arranged to meet that afternoon at the coffee shop near David's house. When David arrived, he immediately recognized Betty from her description, an elderly woman, with silver hair and worried eyes, sitting alone at a corner table. She stood up nervously as he approached. "Dr. Kim, please call me David," he said, extending his hand. "And thank you for reaching out to me." As they sat down together, Betty studied David's face carefully. In the bright light of the coffee shop, he looked nothing like the threatening figure her imagination had created that night. He was clearly tired, with stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, but his manner was gentle and approachable. "David, I need you to know that I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I've never done anything like this before," Betty said. "I'm not the kind of person who calls the police on people for no reason." "I believe you," David replied. "And I understand that recent crimes had everyone more alert than usual." Betty reached into her purse and pulled out a newspaper clipping. "I brought this article about the break-in so you could see what had been happening. 3 houses in nearby neighborhoods, all hit late at night, all by someone who seemed to know the area well." David read the article, noting how the criminal's method of operation, examining houses before breaking in, was exactly what his own behavior had resembled. "I can see why my actions would have seemed suspicious in this context. But that doesn't excuse what I did," Betty said firmly. "I should have watched longer, or maybe approached you directly, or at least considered that there might be an innocent explanation. Mrs. Henderson, Betty, what would you have done if you had approached me that night?" Betty thought about this question seriously. "I probably would have been too frightened to approach a strange man in the dark, which means calling the police felt like the safest option for everyone." "So you were trying to protect yourself and your neighbors," David said. "That's not something to be ashamed of." Over the next hour, Betty and David talked about their respective backgrounds, their concerns about neighborhood safety, and their hopes for preventing similar misunderstandings in the future. Betty learned about David's research, his immigration story, and his deep commitment to helping others. David learned about Betty's 4 decades in the neighborhood, her volunteer work with senior citizens, and her genuine desire to be a good neighbor to everyone. "David, I want to ask you something," Betty said as their conversation drew toward a close. "Would you be willing to speak to our neighborhood association? I think people need to hear your story and learn about the work you're doing." David considered this request carefully. Public speaking wasn't his favorite activity, and he wasn't sure he wanted to relive the details of his arrest in front of a group of neighbors. But he also recognized the opportunity to build bridges and prevent future misunderstandings. "I'll think about it," David said, "but I have a condition. If I speak to the group, I want you to be there too, to tell your side of the story. People need to understand why you called the police, not just why you regret it." Betty looked surprised. "You want me to admit publicly that I racially profiled you?" "I want you to share honestly about how fear and recent crimes influenced your perception," David corrected. "And I want people to hear how you had the courage to reach out and make things right when you learned the truth." 2 weeks later, David stood in front of 30 neighbors gathered in the community center near his home. Betty sat in the front row, having introduced him by telling her own story of that night and the lessons she had learned since then. "I want to talk about misunderstandings," David began, "and how good people can make mistakes that hurt others, even when everyone involved has good intentions." He told his story simply and without anger, explaining his research, his walking habits, and his perspective on what had happened that night. He talked about the officers who had arrested him, praising their professionalism while acknowledging the impact their actions had on him. "The question isn't whether what happened to me was fair," David said. "The question is what we learn from it, and how we use that knowledge to build a stronger community." He proposed several practical solutions: better lighting on walking paths, a neighborhood introduction program for new residents, and regular community meetings where people could get to know each other beyond surface appearances. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I experienced," David concluded. "But I also don't want anyone else to struggle with the guilt that Mrs. Henderson has carried. We can do better, and I believe we will." The response from his neighbors was overwhelmingly positive. Several people approached David after his talk to introduce themselves and learn more about his work. Others apologized for not reaching out sooner to welcome him to the neighborhood. Betty received support and forgiveness from longtime neighbors who admitted they might have made similar mistakes under the same circumstances. In the months that followed, David noticed significant changes in his neighborhood. People made more effort to introduce themselves to newcomers. Residents organized better street lighting and clearer house numbering to help with navigation and identification. The Neighborhood Watch program was expanded to include education about implicit bias and the importance of gathering more information before assuming suspicious intent. David's research progressed well. With several promising developments in his cancer treatment approach, he continued taking evening walks, but now he often encountered neighbors who would stop to chat and ask about his work. The fear and isolation he had felt after his arrest gradually gave way to a sense of genuine community belonging. Betty Henderson became one of David's strongest supporters in the neighborhood, often introducing him to visitors as our local cancer researcher and taking obvious pride in his scientific achievements. Their friendship, built from the ashes of that difficult night, became a model for how people could move beyond mistakes toward mutual understanding and respect. The local police department, learning about the positive community response to David's situation, invited him to speak at their community relations training sessions. His story became a teaching tool for officers learning to balance public safety concerns with fair treatment of all residents. David never forgot the fear and humiliation of being arrested in his own neighborhood. But he also never lost sight of the fact that his experience had catalyzed positive changes that benefited everyone in his community. Sometimes, he reflected, the most valuable lessons came from the most difficult experiences, and the strongest communities were built by people willing to confront their mistakes and work together toward something better.